trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me on this Monday. It's just a week before Christmas, and certainly we have been doing commentaries on the Christmas carols, and so if you have not had a chance to see some of those are my Viewpoints commentaries. We ran a couple last week. We'll run some more this week, and we are going to get into all sorts of issues in the news today. I thought I would say just a little bit about the debacle at the Atlanta airport, because it has some policy implications. And of course, anybody that you know that was traveling through the Atlanta airport last night, you know how miserable their life was. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Then we're going to get into a piece that we have posted, a very good piece by David French, who was in studio with us just a week or two ago. Constant hysterics damage our democracy. And I want to talk a little bit about hysterics and hyperbole in our society, so we'll get into that. We do have a vote coming up here on tax reform, and that will relate as well to some of those conversations, including that material. And if we have time, we might also get into the fact that today President Donald Trump is delivering his speech on national security. And there is a remarkable difference between the national security strategy of this president compared to the previous one. I've already contacted our Millennial Roundtable, which would be Nick Pitts and Chelsea Yeoman, to get into that a little bit more on Wednesday if we don't have time between now and then. But all of that has to happen in the first half hour, because then in the second half hour, we have Sean McDowell with us. He is the author of many books, including with his father, Evidence Demands a Verdict. But this book, which is based upon his doctoral dissertation, The Fate of the Apostles, I think it will be a real encouragement to you as well. And then in the second hour, Ken Stern will be with us. He used to be the CEO of NPR. He's written a piece called Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. I love this because he began to spend time with conservatives, and I always get a kick out how these books are written. It's kind of like, well, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and we'll see what these conservative natives are like. And then, of course, in this case, he changed his mind on a few. Of course, you can imagine if we turned it around and I, said, I'm going to go back to my place of birth in Berkeley, go to UC Berkeley and see what the natives are believing there and what kind of rituals they engage in, and then maybe I'll go to Hollywood or Rockefeller Center or the Academy and see what these natives believe. They would be offended by that. But it is amazing how sometimes liberals will say, well, I was surprised at how rational some of these people that were conservative really were. So we'll spend some time with him in the second hour and go through the book and enjoy that conversation as well. Let's, if we can, though, talk about the Atlanta airport. I love what Jim Garrity said. Yesterday's intolerable mess at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport would have been a little bit easier to accept if it had been cyber terrorism. If ISIS or Al-Qaeda or North Koreans or someone had shut down the power, maybe that would have at least given us someone to blame. But instead, what we're dealing with is a system that is quite vulnerable, and he refers to it as modern fragility. Our modern systems are so fragile because so many of them are tied to computers and those kinds of things. If you've got one of those advanced cars, and up until recently I've driven some pretty non-advanced cars, but this one that I'm driving now that my wife was able to get through some things that she did, have all these fancy computers. And I'm thinking, because of that, just anything can go wrong, and usually does. Well, here is the same kind of situation. This is the busiest airport in the world, and Georgia Power said it believes a failure of its equipment may have started a fire that led to a massive power outage there at the airport, causing more than 1,000 flight cancellations Sunday, disrupting flights for travelers from around the world. Now, they talked about the fact that they had these redundant circuit cables and switching mechanisms, and that the resulting outage actually destroyed or affected the redundant service methods. And so what I thought was interesting is Jim Garrity, in his commentary, said, I'm no engineer, but I thought the whole point of having a backup power system or redundant circuit cables was that they were in a different place from the main system or cables, so that whatever interrupts the first one wouldn't interrupt the second one. Now, we'll find out a little bit later on, but we can see the disruption that took place just in this one particular situation alone, and that's at the Atlanta airport. 30,000 people were affected by the power outage, and in addition to just the fact that there was this breakdown in technology, there was also a breakdown in communication. Some passengers told CNN that airport and airline staff offered no updates as hours passed, leaving people scanning their phones and tablets for information. Stores stopped serving food and passengers were evacuated to alleviate crowding. Many of them had to turn on the flashlight on their phone to just make their way through the airport. So before I get into the policy implication, how about 3 cheers for Chick-fil-A? I read this morning in the daily briefing by Nick Pitts, so I pulled this up. And it turns out that, as you well know, Chick-fil-A does not serve on Sunday. And they broke their golden rule for a very good reason. The Atlanta-based food chain is well known for being closed on Sundays, it says, but when a major power outage crippled the airport, Chick-fil-A provided food for the thousands of stranded passengers. The CEO of Chick-fil-A, Dan Cathy, personally helped hand out sandwiches. Do you love that? Again, this is the organization that is vilified by the left. I did a commentary a while back where the various city council in Denver didn't even want Chick-fil-A to be in the Denver airport because they have the wrong values, of course. And here, who's handing out water? Who's handing out Chick-fil-A meals? Not only Chick-fil-A people that had the day off, but the CEO himself was handing those out. And you look at some of these Twitter posts and things like that. Obviously, the city of Atlanta tried to mobilize individuals from the Georgia International Convention Centers. Let's give credit where credit was due there as well. But a lot of the people that actually received those food items actually received them from Chick-fil-A. So this is the organization that the left loves to hate, yet they were the ones on the scene giving up their free Sunday so that they could feed some of those passengers. But the point I want to make is in addition today, we're also going to hear the president, as he announces his new national security strategy, also wants to actually make a priority the U.S. electric grid. And yesterday's electrical fire that affected 30,000 individuals, I think, illustrates how vulnerable our energy grid is. When you look at the fact that parts of Puerto Rico are still without power 3 months after Hurricane Maria, you can see that that island's electric grid is certainly vulnerable. And when we hear that North Korea, and maybe even Iran, someday would like to use an electromagnetic pulse, that is where you would shoot a rocket up into space, blow off an a nuclear bomb, and send an EMF, an electromagnetic pulse, down to actually destroy our electric grid. This is why I think we need to make sure that we have a secure electric grid. So if nothing else, there's an obvious, I think, policy implication. What we saw was a very fragile electrical system. Our power grid at the world's busiest airport in Atlanta illustrates maybe why this speech given today by President Donald Trump is an important one, and why we need to begin to fortify our electric grid. Let's take a break. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and I thought it might be worthwhile to spend a moment to reflect on the words of the hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. It was written in 1867 by Philip Brooks, an Episcopal pastor from Philadelphia. He was in Israel 2 years earlier and had celebrated Christmas in Bethlehem, and he wrote this song to reflect on what that night of the birth of Jesus might be like.
O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in the dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. You know, while the streets of our cities are quiet on Christmas Day, most likely that day was just like any other day for the people in Bethlehem. But as evening came, the town grew quiet, and something remarkable took place. In the second verse, the hymn says, "While mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love." Just like today, our world goes about its business, usually oblivious to the spiritual realities around it. Jesus came into the world quietly. Yes, there was the angelic announcement to the shepherds, but most other people were unaware of the fact that the most significant event in history was taking place. God became man. But he was born in a stable and laid in a feeding trough. There was no pomp or circumstance as you might expect of a king. Jesus came not only to live among us, but to ultimately die for our sins. He took upon himself the sins of the world, your sins and my sins, and paid the ultimate penalty that we deserve to pay that we might have everlasting life. During this Christmas week, I hope you'll stop long enough to consider what happened in that little town of Bethlehem. But even more so, I hope you will think about what Jesus did for you on Calvary. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Certainly wanted to give a high five or an attaboy or whatever you might want to call it for Chick-fil-A, because as we pointed out, even though these workers were supposed to be off on Sunday, they decided to break their golden rule. It was for a good cause, and the CEO also was there handing out meals, and I think that's pretty impressive. So that's one of those, if you will, opportunities to say something positive. And another one that I might mention, and that is, this comes from Senator John Cornyn. We did talk about it on Friday, but again, I know some people don't hear every program every day. President Trump actually has broken a record for the most appellate court judges confirmed in the first year of a president's term. As I pointed out on Friday, the old record was 11 under John F. Kennedy and 11 under Richard Nixon, but there were actually 12 appellate court judges, I should say, confirmed under Donald Trump, and the last two were Don Willett, who's actually here from the state of Texas, know pretty much about him, and also Justice Jim Ho, who's been a good friend of Kelly Shackelford. So kind of fun to see how that has played itself out. And so that's just another one of those positives that we like to talk about. And if you did not have a chance to find this article, Cal Thomas wrote one which we posted on Friday, Trump's Accomplishments Obscured by Distractions, in which he reminds us that, you know, we have 3% growth rate. It could, in the fourth quarter, be a 4% growth rate in light of what the Federal Reserve just announced. Unemployment at its lowest level since 2000, a 17-year low for African Americans, and very low unemployment for other racial and ethnic groups. You can go through a variety of things. One other one I always like to mention is we've been hearing for years that, you know, once we lose manufacturing jobs, well, that's it. They're never coming back again. But in some cases, we can see that that may not necessarily be an accurate reflection of what is taking place because, as I pointed out, when you look at that, 159,000 manufacturing jobs have been created since the president first took office. So there are some positive things out there to certainly talk about, and we will do that here, as always, on Point of View. Let me just go to our first article that we've posted, and then we'll have Sean McDowell with us at the bottom of the hour. And this one is by our good friend David French, Constant Hysterics Damage Our Democracy. And he started writing about this because he saw all the apocalyptic rhetoric about the repeal of net neutrality rules and all the rest. And he said, he used to have this idea that he actually took from the old animated cartoon, The Incredibles, when everyone's super, no one will be. Of course, we've said the same thing. If everybody's called a racist, then nobody's a racist. If everybody's called a Nazi, nobody's a Nazi. If everybody's called a fascist, nobody's a fascist. He said he had to really kind of change his mind on that because he says, except in politics, because in politics, when everything's a crisis, it turns out everything's a crisis. And he just talks about the fact that we are dealing with hysterics and hyperbole in every area. I'll just read one paragraph to give you a flavor of what he's talking about. He says, we keep reading that Donald Trump is a unique danger to American democracy, a threat we should put aside partisan tribalism to defeat. Then second later, we read that giving Americans the choice to buy health insurance will kill people by the thousands. Seconds after that, we learned that the entirely conventional Republican tax plan will not only kill people, but will extinguish American democracy as we know it. Finally, we read that the end of net neutrality will be, of course, extinguishing American liberty and will be the end of the Internet as we know it. I added that last part, but that was from a previous part of his article there as well. And the point he's making is one that I've made before as well, and that is we have so much hyperbole taking place, so many hysterics. I could add to that, that this economic plan, this tax reform bill that's going to be voted on this week is going to be economic Armageddon, and it's going to make the middle class poorer, and it's going to hurt them. And as we've said, can we just take one statistic? We don't have to get into all the details. 70% of Americans file a standard deduction, right? 70%. That's a number that we can say with certainty. And if you're going to double the standard deduction, do you think their taxes are going to go up when you double the standard deduction for 70% of the American people? I don't think so. And so you don't even have to go any further than that. Or the net neutrality. The FCC implemented 2 years ago under the Obama administration from ideas that were actually put forward in what was called the Net Communist Manifesto. So first of all, you kind of wonder where that came from. But nevertheless, okay, if we needed those rules, then explain to me why in the previous almost 20 years we didn't need those rules. We've implemented them now in the last 2 years. Investment seems to have gone down in the Internet. Are we actually going to destroy the Internet by removing rules that we've only had for 2 years? And, okay, let's say we made a mistake. Is it possible the FCC could re-implement those rules? Or, more importantly, is it possible that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, would be a better commission to address something where there was unfairness or there was some kind of manipulation? There's a good question there. And when you get into health care, we all know the drill on that one, because what you hear is one side says if we keep Obamacare, we'll destroy the health care market and people will die. But if we repeal Obamacare, quality health care will disappear and people will die. And I think most Americans are starting to say, can we just cool some of the rhetoric? And I hope that you will be one of those individuals in this coming year to try to do that. But getting back to the piece by David French real quickly, he says, for the average American who pays less attention to politics than to his professional and personal lives, all of this is exhausting. It is numbing to the point where he can't possibly determine what's important and what's not. So he checks out. He throws his hands in the air and gives up. But for Americans who care the most about politics and drive our public debate, perpetual crisis is invigorating. It means meaning and purpose. And so he points out all the problems with the constant attempt to explain everything in terms of a crisis. And I do believe that as we come to this new year, maybe we could get to a point where we recognize that first of all, we need to tune some of that out. And more importantly, I think it's about time for some of us citizens, and maybe even calling for some of our political leaders, to speak out against some of these reckless claims, because it is not helpful. And all through this next 2018 election, if we just keep hearing that if we do this, people are going to die. If we don't do this, people are going to die. After a while, it's just going to guarantee that fewer and fewer people are going to pay attention. Fewer and fewer people are going to go to the polls. Fewer and fewer people are going to trust the American political system. And when it's already at an all-time low, maybe it's time to turn some of that around. So I even have a commentary coming out next year in 2018 on this, but I wanted you to read this piece in its entirety by David French. It's on our website, pointofview.net. And in just a minute, we'll be talking with Sean McDowell about his new book, The Fate of the Apostles, examining the martyrdom accounts of the closest followers of Jesus. And we're doing this because I think one of the most powerful arguments for the truthfulness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is what could possibly explain how these scattered, fearful disciples then all of a sudden are bold, and almost all of them are willing to die a martyr's death unless they had actually seen the risen Christ. And so we're going to get into some of that. I think you're going to appreciate this area of apologetics and also learn a little bit more about the fate of Peter and Paul and Thomas and a variety of others. So Sean McDowell will be with us in just a minute. But as we go to the break, let me just mention that we are celebrating 45 years of broadcasting. And just over a week ago, we had Foster Freeze on the program, and in light of that, out of nowhere, he said, I'd like to put forth a $45,000 matching challenge, $45,000 for the 45 years that Point of View has been broadcasting. And some people say, well, how are we doing? Not very well. You got to recognize that a week from today is Christmas. 2 weeks from today, it's a new year. So we only have less than 2 weeks to meet that challenge. And we're sort of halfway in terms of the challenge. We're not even a quarter of the way. We're not even an eighth of the way to that. So we certainly need you to consider what you might do to join with us. Now, you can make a cash gift, and you can do that by going to the website, pointofview.net, put it on your credit card, or you certainly can write to us and say, I want my gift to be matched. We also the other day talked about some of you might have appreciated stock, and that might be significant as well, and that would also be matched by this matching challenge. And so I hope that you might consider right now what you might want to do. Recognize that this time next week, you're not going to be thinking about this because you'll be celebrating Christmas, and 2 weeks from now, it'll be too late. So I hope that you will consider taking the time now in the next day or two, perhaps even as we go to a break here, clicking on the button, and it gives you an opportunity to click on the button that says Give Now. We explain a little bit more about the challenge and the opportunity for you to help us match that, and we have some suggested gift totals, and so we hope that you will do so. Your gift of $100 becomes $200. A gift of $250 becomes $500. Do what you can to help us out. We'll be back with Sean McDowell right after this.
Taylor has been listening to Point of View Radio for about 12 years, which is pretty remarkable considering today he's only 25.
In high school, when I first became aware of the political spectrum and all that, I was a conservative ideologue, basically, going with whatever conservatives said. But after listening to the show over the years, I realized that I'm supposed to be for truth. I'm supposed to be a Christian and then a conservative. And I'm supposed to look at all this that's going on around us in today's culture through a biblical lens. And I can't thank y'all enough for that.
The you Taylor is thanking is you. People like you are the heroes who have patiently invested in Point of View Radio and made it possible to shape hearts and minds across the nation, which in the long run helps to shape our future. And you can be twice the hero today because we have a matching challenge which doubles your investment dollar for dollar up to at least $45,000. But you have to act. Please give at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Your $50 gift means $100 to us. Any amount doubles. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
One of the significant arguments for the resurrection that we use often is the remarkable change in the lives of the disciples. Here are individuals that saw Christ crucified. Peter denies Christ 3 times. They're scattered. They're demoralized. And then they boldly proclaim Christianity right there in Jerusalem and begin to take the gospel throughout the ancient world. And most of them die a martyr's death. But oftentimes we wonder how accurate some of those stories are, because as we've talked on this program before, sometimes there's the biblical truth and there's what is added to it. We just talked about that a week ago in terms of the wise men and the magi. And so we come back to this very important issue. And Sean McDowell is with us. Dr. Sean McDowell is a friend that has been part of this ministry for some time. He's assistant professor in Christian apologetics and the program there at Biola University, an individual that graduated from Talbot Theological Seminary with 2 different master's degrees and a PhD in apologetics and worldview studies from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Author of a number of books, Same-Sex Marriage, Is God Just a Human Invention, Understanding Intelligent Design, lots of books that he's written with his father, Josh McDowell, The Beauty of Intolerance, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, More Than a Carpenter, Unshakable Truth. But this book is a new one, The Fate of the Apostles, Examining the Martyrdom Accounts of the Closest Followers of Jesus. Sean McDowell, thanks for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, as always, thanks for having me on. This is fun.
One of the things I might just say to our listeners is I've been using this over the last couple of weeks in my own Sunday school class, because as we were going through the book of Acts, we get to the martyrdom of Stephen, and I thought, well, let's just, if we can, educate people on all of these other stories as well. And so tell us a little bit about this. It's a 300-page book. It's one that I think our people that are doing apologetics would really value, because what you do is try to sort out fact from fiction, tradition from what we can historically verify. So talk about how you went about trying to analyze some of these historical accounts.
Sure. This project actually began as a part of my PhD dissertation. I was looking for a topic that I could contribute to the world of apologetics and scholarship. And my father, people like Lee Strobel, and hosts of others had really popularized how the deaths of the apostles is an apologetic for the resurrection. And it always made sense to me. But in the back of my mind was always like, how do we really know? What are the sources? How many sources? How early? And this thought hit me when I was actually on a trip to Berkeley with high school students. We brought in an atheist to speak to him, and this guy argued that Jesus didn't even exist. One of my students said, if Jesus didn't exist, why would all the apostles die as martyrs? And this atheist looked back at us and he goes, give me evidence that any of them died as a martyr. And they all unanimously turned and looked at me, and I remember thinking, you know what? I don't have as good of an answer for this as I would like to. So I spent about 3 years tracking down every conceivable source, trying to see, number one, if this is a good argument, and if so, how would we frame it? What I really found is I think we've overstated the argument a little bit.
Sure.
Without doing our due diligence. But the argument can be stated, and here's essentially what it is. There's a few pieces. Number one, we know the apostles uniquely believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. So the earliest accounts we have was to be a Christian is to believe that Jesus had risen from the grave, and the apostles were eyewitnesses. Second, we know they were all willing to suffer and die for the conviction that Jesus had risen. We see this in Acts 4 and in Acts 5. And as you said, with Stephen, his willingness to die. And then we also know there's no record that any of them recanted. And then fourth, I think we know at least that 4 of the apostles with high confidence died as martyrs. 2 of them are arguably more probable than not. And then the rest of them, I think it's hard to know where fiction kind of begins and history ends. So the bottom line is this doesn't prove the resurrection is true. But their willingness to suffer and die shows they didn't make it up. This wasn't a conspiracy. They really believed they had seen the risen Jesus.
And when we talk about those that have the high probability, we're talking about Peter and Paul, James the son of Zebedee, and James the brother of Jesus. And when we talk about some that maybe are a little less plausible, that when we're in like Philip, Matthew, Thaddeus, and things of that nature. And so what you do is you go through all sorts of early church records, the early church fathers and some other historical records, and try to get a sense of what is possible, what's plausible, what is probably a little less likely because it's surrounded in all sorts of myth and tradition and legend, and we don't really have any kind of independent verification. But at the end, I would say maybe we overstated the argument a little bit, but still a pretty powerful argument, don't you think?
I do think it is a powerful argument. We have to remember that history always deals with probabilities, and we do our best as historians to make it as much of a science as we can, but you do have to make inferences based on the evidence. So you're right, Peter, Paul, and both James, there's a consistent testimony in the first and the second century. There's no contradictory evidence that I could find. In fact, in the case of Peter, we have two first-century accounts. One is John 21, when Jesus says, "You'll be taken where you do not want to go, your hands will be tied." And then the writer of John says, this is to indicate how he would die. And then you have a record in a writing called First Clement from probably AD 90, which is AD 95, roughly the decade that the Gospel of John was probably written in,
right,
also referring to the martyrdom of Peter. So we have two first-century accounts probably within 30 years. And then if you go through the second century, we have 10 accounts, some with greater value than others. They unanimously say Peter died as a martyr, and I think the best evidence is that he was in Rome. So I think the argument still works. We just have to remember, again, that it doesn't prove the resurrection is true. It's one piece of a larger argument that shows.
I think we lost him. So we'll get him back on as soon as we can. But again, that is the book entitled The Fate of the Apostles, examining the martyrdom accounts of the closest followers of Jesus. When we come back, we'll get him back in just a second. And one of the things we certainly want to do is spend just another minute or two on Peter, because we do, from a lot of different sources, like Clement and Ignatius and others, know that he was martyred. We know that he was crucified. I want to get into a question in just a minute as to whether or not we know whether he was crucified upside down, because that's one of the questions people have always asked. And then we'll get into the martyrdom of Paul and a few of the others. But it's just a fascinating book. And if you've always wanted to find a good, independent kind of historical verification for the life of the disciples and certainly how they lived, this is a book that I certainly would recommend to you. And it takes you into some detail. As I mentioned, it is 300 pages. It also has just an extensive bibliography as well as all sorts of footnotes. So if you find yourself engaged in a debate or a discussion with somebody, or maybe you just would like to read a little bit more about the martyrdom. You know, after all, some of you are familiar with some of the historic books like Fox's Book of Martyrs and others. This would be a book that certainly you might want to put on your shelf. So again, Sean McDowell will join us again as soon as we get him back on the phone. And let me just mention that, again, we have some great opportunities to learn about the martyrdom of a few of these individuals. And we were looking at the subject of Peter. Then we'll look at Paul, maybe the two, James, and then probably that's all that we have. Sean, let me come back to this because we can say that Peter was probably martyred during the Neronian persecution, during the reign of Nero, probably in Rome. But the big question is, was Peter crucified upside down? And more importantly, did he ask to be that? That's where I think we have some real questions, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The common story that Christians will say is Peter was crucified upside down. Now, the earliest account we have of being crucified upside down is in a document called the Acts of Peter, and it dates to the end of the 2nd century. And typically when people are asked, was Peter crucified upside down, they'll say that he requested so because he didn't want to be crucified right side up like Jesus. Well, let me ask you a question, Kerby, and I'm sure you know the answer to this. Do you think the Romans took advice on how somebody wanted to?
And I think we know the answer to that is no. And I've read other crucifixion accounts, especially when they crucified those individuals when Titus conquered Jerusalem, and they crucified people sideways, upside down. They tried to find the most horrific ways to kill people. So this may not have been a request from Peter. It just may have been something that happened that later some myth and tradition might have developed around it, don't you think?
I think that's well said. We do have precedent that people are crucified upside down, but if you read the earliest account in the Acts of Peter, there's actually a theological point being made, namely that the world is upside down, and when Peter's upside down, he can actually see it upright. And his death, like the death of Jesus, will help correct it. It's not till the 3rd and 4th century that church historians start taking that as historical. But to me, when you go back to the earliest documents, I'm very skeptical that that's what they were trying to argue. I think it's possible, but not probable. But for my argument, it really doesn't matter ultimately how he died as a martyr. It just shows that the key is, was he willing to, and did he die as a martyr? And the consistent earliest accounts, even Bart Ehrman, the great skeptic today, says that it's likely he died as a martyr.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll maybe talk a little bit about the martyrdom of Paul, and then just, again, how these kinds of books, so many of those written by Sean McDowell and his father Josh McDowell, can be used by you to lead people to Christ. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Sean McDowell right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. As the school semester winds down to Christmas break, it's important to take a look at all the ways students might exercise their religious freedom in celebration of the holidays. First, schools can celebrate Christmas just as easily as they can celebrate winter. Doing so provides an educational perspective of world history and the effect of religion upon culture. Schools can also deck the halls in Christmas decorations. Decorations can further the cultural and religious heritage educationally important to the holiday. Third, schools can include Christmas-themed artistic expressions in school plays. As long as it's presented in an objective manner reflecting the traditions of Christmas, it's just fine. It is fine for students to wish one another Merry Christmas or Happy Hanukkah, and even hand out gifts significant to their religious tradition. As they can throughout the year, students can also reference their faith in school assignments, class discussions, and private speeches during the holidays. The First Amendment is not suspended during the Christmas season. And finally, school employees can discuss their religious holiday traditions outside of their official roles as educators. This means teachers can attend Christmas parties and religious gatherings outside of work without fearing the loss of their job. With that, perhaps the best way to conclude is merely to say Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and best wishes for a Happy New Year to all our students. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Sean McDowell. And again, I want to encourage you to go not only to his website, but also for those of you that really are into the area of apologetics, you really want to be effective in terms of your witness before the unbelieving world. This book, The Fate of the Apostles, is one that I made a point of getting a copy of and wanted you to know about it as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Sean McDowell has been with us over the years. Matter of fact, he was supposed to be with us when we had our week where we were celebrating our 45 years of broadcasting on Point of View, and I'm glad that he could join us today. Let's talk for just a minute about the martyrdom of Paul, because again, just as we believe that Peter was killed during the Neronian persecution, during the time when Nero was in office. We also believe that Paul obviously went to Rome and Paul was martyred there. But what else do we know about that?
Well, the earliest accounts we have of Paul, interestingly, in 2 Timothy, which is the last book, arguably, that Paul wrote, he talks about saying, my life is about to be poured out like a libation. He says, I fought the good fight. In other words, I finished the race. He knows that his suffering is coming to an end, and it's about to cost him his life. That doesn't prove it, but that's really good information that Paul knows his life is about to be taken from him. And then you go to a document called First Clement, again, the end of the first century, and it refers to both Peter and Paul as dying as martyrs. And then you go into the 2nd century, Kerby, and consistently the narrative is that Paul finished the race and he ended his life as a martyr. And there's no contradictory evidence against it. So I think we land on really good, solid historical ground to believe that Paul actually died as a martyr.
You also raised the question, was Paul beheaded? And again, this is where I want to give people a sense that they don't want to overplay the argument, but what have we learned in that regard?
Well, the earliest accounts of him being beheaded show up in the end of the 2nd century. So historically speaking, that's still relatively early, but the earliest sources don't report how he was martyred. But I think that's really reasonable. We have John the Baptist being beheaded. We have James, the son of Zebedee, being killed with a sword, likely beheaded. And Paul was a Roman citizen, so they wouldn't have crucified him. Beheading was the standard means of execution for somebody who was a citizen. So the key is that Paul died as a martyr. And I'd say it's probably pretty likely that he was beheaded as well.
One other one I thought we'd add, because I don't want to go through all 12, but I thought the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus. Again, that is significant, if for no other reason than here's an individual that grew up with Jesus, obviously was very skeptical about whether Jesus really was the Messiah, and then goes out and is killed as well. So what do we know about the martyrdom of James?
Well, it's really interesting. We look in John 7 and Mark 3, we're told that the brothers of Jesus essentially did not believe in him during his lifetime. But then we're told in Acts that James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem. What's the best explanation? Well, we're told in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus appears to James. What's fascinating about James is he's the only apostle with an early, distinctly non-Christian source, Josephus, describing his manner of death, that he's actually martyred. Now, it's tied up with political issues, but the religion and the politics were mixed together at that time, just like it was with Jesus. So with James, we have a first-century source describing his death, and then we also have Gnostic sources in the 2nd century describing his death, and there's no contradictory evidence. Now, what you do see, Kerby, is in the middle of the 2nd century in the end, you kind of see these legends start to flower around the story of his martyrdom, but the core of him dying as a martyr is consistent, and it's early, and it's tied to his belief and proclamation of the risen Jesus. So I think we have good reason to believe that the brother of Jesus really died as a martyr.
And a lot of these sources, as you mentioned just a minute ago, are Gnostic sources, and I think you can still sometimes rely somewhat on them for history and some kind of perspective. I would never rely on them for theology, because oftentimes they're teaching heresy and those kinds of ideas. But nevertheless, we do have some contemporaneous sources, and I think this is still, as you said before, it's a good argument. We just don't want to overplay it. And if nothing else, I think your book is such a good corrective to, we still have good reasons to believe that these individuals died as martyrs, but we have better evidence for some, the ones we just mentioned, maybe a few others, than we do for the others, and that's sufficient enough to sort of make our case. And so the next time an atheist at the University of California at Berkeley asks you, what evidence do you have? You can say, well, I got First Clement, I've got Ignatius, in some cases I got Josephus, and that should be sufficient for any fair-minded person, don't you think?
I think so. I think it's sufficient to say that they really believed Jesus had risen from the grave, and it shows they didn't steal the body. It shows it wasn't a conspiracy theory. I mean, why would they invent this entire story based on something if it wasn't true? Since they were eyewitnesses, they would have known it wasn't true and then willingly suffer, and at least some of them die as martyrs. It doesn't make sense, and it goes against everything we know. Now, other people say, well, what about people like Muslim terrorists or others who died for their beliefs? Well, they were not eyewitnesses of Muhammad or any alleged miracles that he did. The apostles were eyewitnesses. That's what makes their testimony unique and distinct.
Well, again, if people would like to know a little bit more of this new book, The Fate of the Apostles, and let me just also commend to all of our listeners Evidence That Demands a Verdict. First of all, I've got the original copies, but the new one that you and your father put in, including some of the material from this book and other material, is just outstanding. So those are great resources, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk for just a minute with you about how individuals that might really seriously want to study apologetics or philosophy can actually enroll at Biola University, or even if they can't come to Los Angeles area, they can online learn. So talk about what is available if people want to study more some of these things and even get an academic degree.
Sure. I'm glad you mentioned the updated Evidence Demands Verdict, because the book, The Fate of the Apostles, is over $100. It's one of those expensive academic books, so check it out from your library. You can certainly buy it, but I didn't know it was going to cost that much. It's really an academic book, but I took all that research and added a new chapter in the updated Evidence That Demands a Verdict.
Yes.
That really is kind of the one place to go to get all the sources, the arguments, the response, if somebody wants to explore the Fate of the Apostles further. Now, the Biola degree, we have a distance MA in apologetics degree. We have people from 25 to 75, every walk of life, teachers, doctors, lawyers, stay-at-home moms who want to get trained in apologetics, from people who want to do it as a hobby, get educated to help their church, to people who want to do further studies. And we just recently were the top-rated apologetics degree by Best Schools, the Best Schools website. And it's really a special program. We just had graduation with 25 students going out to make a difference in their families, in their culture, in their workplace, in their church. So if you're looking to put a lot of stuff into practice that I know you talk about in Point of View all the time, think about joining us in the Biola Apologetics program.
Again, just outstanding resources. So, Sean, thank you so very much for taking a little bit of time out of your busy day, and Merry Christmas.
Kerby, I'm a huge fan of you personally and Point of View. Thanks for having me on and just speaking truth on these sensitive issues of the day. Keep it up.
Thank you. Sean McDowell, and again, I would encourage you to find some of those books. Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the updated version, just outstanding. So many new chapters in there, as well as great material that benefited all of us over these various years. And, of course, More Than a Carpenter, as well as some of the other books that he's written in the past on same-sex marriage, Is God Just a Human Invention, Understanding Intelligent Design, and much, much more. You know, we mentioned just the fact that we had 45 years of ministry back in 1972. Marlon Maddox started Point of View, 1972. Can you believe that? And, of course, I began to do interviews with him in the 1980s and actually began to be a guest host in 1986. So I've been doing it for more than 30 years, but I was a late comer, if you think about it. 45 years, but as I've mentioned just a few minutes ago, we also have an opportunity for you to not only give to this ministry, but have your gift doubled, because we have that $45,000 match challenge. And you can go to the website, pointofview.net. But also, if you'd like to talk to someone off air and give them your credit card number, that's 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. We'll be back right after this.
Today, you can make a difference, but you have to act. Recently, Kerby sat down with a couple in California, Stan and Jennifer. Jennifer said, like many Christians, they were concerned about the direction of the culture, but simply hoped something would change. On one of her regular walks through the neighborhood, listening to the radio, she happened to cross Point of View, and before long, she was convinced wishing things would change was not enough. She began taking what she was learning and applying it and sharing it. She even went to the state capitol in Sacramento to stand up for what she believes. You would be surprised how much difference one Jennifer can make, and how many Jennifers you can inspire by giving to Point of View. Your gift today will shape hearts and minds across the nation, helping to shape our future. And thanks to a surprise donor challenge, your gift will be doubled up to at least $45,000. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Answer the challenge. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Let's, if we can, spend some time today talking about this polarization that has taken place here in America. We've talked about it quite a bit here on Point of View, and we recognize that in some respects we almost live in two different countries. I remember what Michael Barone one time said. He said most people in the San Francisco Bay Area wouldn't consider living in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, even for much better money, but most Metroplexers would never relocate to the Bay Area. Well, I've lived in both. I was born in Berkeley, grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. This broadcast is coming to you from the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, so I've seen both. And yet we recognize, if you've ever read the book Big Sort by Bill Bishop, he talks about the fact that Democrats live with one set of rules, Republicans live with another. Democrats watch Sunday morning news shows and late-night television. Republicans go to church. Republicans spend time with their family, get their news from Fox News. Democrats may get it from different other sources. Even as simple as, I remember in the book, he said, Democrats are more likely to own cats, Republicans are more likely to own dogs. I don't know how true that is, but nevertheless, we can certainly see some of that. And that's why we thought this would be a fascinating book to talk about for an hour with Ken Stern, Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. He is the president of Palisades Media Ventures. He's the former CEO of National Public Radio and joins us now by phone. So, Ken, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, Kerby, thanks for having me on the show.
Tell us about this little venture, because we're going to travel to all sorts of places. They're going to get to give you a chance to shoot a hog in Texas and go to the Creation Museum in Kentucky and all sorts of other things. But where did this idea come from initially?
Well, so it all started, I'll give you the sort of the setup. It all started in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C. I live in a 94% Democratic ward, 100% Democratic household. And like a lot of people, I'm concerned about the increasing polarization, how angry we are at the other side. But it really started for me one day at our annual block party called Porch Fest.
Porch Fest, right.
My street's called Hobart Street. It's got a lot of team spirit, and it's got the Hobart Street Pledge, which I always liked. But one year I bothered to listen to it. It went something like, all are welcome on Hobart Street, man or woman, gay or straight, black or white, everyone but Republicans.
I know when I first read that, I said, really? That was actually said. So, it's, I pledge allegiance to Hobart Street Northwest, gay or straight, woman or man, all are welcome on Hobart Street except for Republicans. Whoops, where did that come from? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, it was a joke, but, it wasn't a joke.
Yes. I've been in both worlds, so I understand that only so well.
Yeah, so that sort of got me to thinking and set me on this journey to figure out what the other side is like. You want to understand someone, you try to see things from their point of view. And so I spent a better part of a year, actually more than a year, traveling the country, talking to people I wouldn't ordinarily see in my liberal bubble, and getting to know a different part of the country. And it was a great experience.
Well, and again, I mentioned from Big Sword, I've written a commentary years ago about that, and then you have mentioned it as well. But let's just go through some of the venues, and one of those is to shoot a pig. I love this because, I grew up, and when I was a kid in California, we didn't have guns. As a matter of fact, I think I shot a pellet gun once or twice, but that was it. And I can remember the day when I was in Texas where I said, I would at least like to know how to shoot a handgun if I ever wanted to do that, and took a class on it. And here you're talking about the same kind of thing. Here you decided to maybe go to a skeet shooting place to shoot a shotgun for a little bit, but all of a sudden you find yourself hunting hogs. Tell us more.
Yeah, so I wanted to tell the story of traveling the country through a number of issues, which I thought were actually important points of divide between the left and the right. And one was gun control or gun rights, depending on your perspective. And I wanted to experience it. So I spent time with John Locke, a conservative economist.
Mm-hmm.
I went to gun shows, and I wanted to go shooting. And so I decided to go pig hunting in Texas. And first time I ever held a gun was about a week before when I went skeet shooting near my home.
Yes.
And turned out I was a terrible shot. And then it didn't turn me. I went hunting in Texas. Spent the morning with a family from Georgia, and then spent the afternoon with a group of guys from Houston. And it was a sort of a marvelous group of people. In the morning, my mentor was an 8-year-old boy named Isaac, who sort of taught me the ropes and taught me a thing or two about hunting and sort of family relationships.
Well, and again, help us understand kind of both sides, since you have now kind of lived in that world. Because on the one hand, you have some that are just saying, let's use, since you were using a rifle, that we just need to get rid of AR-15s. And as you, I think, aptly say there, if we banned them tomorrow, it wouldn't bother you, but it wouldn't make any difference, because as we've learned from John Lott when he's been on this program and others, whether it's an AR-15 or a Sig Sauer MCX, which was used in Orlando, those are not used for the kinds of issues that we're talking about in terms of real gun deaths. But nevertheless, help us understand why, I guess if you live in a world like you're in Virginia or Maryland or New York or Boston or someplace like that, you're just not around guns. So there's a sense that there's something nefarious taking place in gun shows. There's something dangerous about even having a gun locked up in a gun safe in a home. So explain that for us, if you might.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of, like a lot of things, there's a lot of things to learn from both sides. And, of course, on one side there is, look, we've long had a problem with homicide in this country. Our rate of murder is disproportionate compared to other similarly situated countries in Western Europe. But what you learn when you really dive into issues is we're quite different. We have 300 million guns in circulation, and most of those things that grab the attention of the news media, my news media, are the mass killings, the ones with the AR-15s,
right,
and other long guns. But the vast majority of killings take place in urban areas with handguns that are largely illegally obtained anyway. So that the gun control measures, which us liberals, and I'll still put myself in the camp in some way, because that's where I still live, we're fond of gun control proposals, but none of them really get us to the heart of the problem. And that's because the heart of the problem is really hard. And a lot of rhetoric around guns and gun issues miss the nuances of public policy and solving complex public issues.
Well, and again, this book is one that I think would just be helpful for you to kind of understand both sides, about 300 pages. We'll come back and talk about the Party of God and maybe get into a few others, Basket of Deplorables, the Party of Science, Greatest Society. How can we address some of these issues ranging from, as we just mentioned a minute ago, gun control, religious liberty, helping the poor, and a variety of others. And it's just a fascinating look at an individual that was willing to get out of sort of his comfort zone, his sorted area, and go and meet some other individuals. And I think there is some real value in doing that, because we seem to be talking at each other. There's a polarization that takes place, and it has gotten worse, as we were even mentioning in the first hour by the piece that we posted by David French about hysterics really damaging democracy, some of these kind of radical, hysterical statements of hyperbole. And so we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about that. You will probably be able to find the book in your local bookstore, but we do have a link on our website, pointofview.net. And if you find it in your bookstore, Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. We have a lot more to cover, and we'll do so with Ken Stern right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and I thought it might be worthwhile to spend a moment to reflect on the words of the hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. It was written in 1867 by Philip Brooks, an Episcopal pastor from Philadelphia. He was in Israel 2 years earlier and had celebrated Christmas in Bethlehem, and he wrote this song to reflect on what that night of the birth of Jesus might be like. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in the dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. You know, while the streets of our cities are quiet on Christmas Day, most likely that day was just like any other day for the people in Bethlehem. But as evening came, the town grew quiet, and something remarkable took place. In the second verse, the hymn says, While mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love. Just like today, our world goes about its business, usually oblivious to the spiritual realities around it. Jesus came into the world quietly. Yes, there was the angelic announcement to the shepherds, but most other people were unaware of the fact that the most significant event in history was taking place. God became man. But he was born in a stable and laid in a feeding trough. There was no pomp or circumstance as you might expect of a king. Jesus came not only to live among us, but to ultimately die for our sins. He took upon himself the sins of the world, your sins and my sins, and paid the ultimate penalty that we deserve to pay that we might have everlasting life. During this Christmas week, I hope you'll stop long enough to consider what happened in that little town of Bethlehem. But even more so, I hope you will think about what Jesus did for you on Calvary. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Ken Stern. His book is entitled Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right, and we have information about that. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, so I would encourage you to read it. I think you'll find it fascinating. And Ken, let's, if we can, just for a few minutes, talk about the Party of God. And again, high marks to you for being willing to go to Urbana, Liberty University, to just kind of check some of that out, because as you point out, you know, oftentimes religious services for you seem quite boring. But what did you find when you actually went to some of these events?
So, Kerby, you know, you can't understand Republicans in America without understanding evangelicals. So,
that's right.
Evangelicals went like 85-15 for Trump, and that's pretty much been the way it's been for a generation. You know, here I am, an agnostic Jew from Washington, D.C. Where do I go? And I ended up going to a lot of different places. I got adopted by a lovely Assembly of God church in Fredericksburg, Virginia, Pastor Steve, and I went to mega churches. But probably the most interesting experience I had was going to Urbana, 15,000 evangelical youth in St. Louis, Missouri. Not much in common between me and them, age, religion, background, but really grew to admire these kids. You know, I wanted to talk to them about the issues I thought they'd want to talk about, gay rights, abortion, but they wanted to talk about, you know, helping the poor, housing the homeless, helping refugees. That was what was on their mind, and it was really an admirable group of people I would never have met without this experience.
One of the things we do on Wednesdays, we have a millennial roundtable. They still let me attend. I'm the old guy, but everybody else is a millennial. And those are the issues. You know, there is a sense in which the evangelical millennials are saying, and of course I recognize there are fewer of them because one of the fastest growing demographic groups in the millennial generation are the nones, none of the above. They're not atheist, agnostic, no preference kind of thing. But of those that are, they're very much involved, not just in wanting to say give to that, but get involved in that, whether it's urban ministry, whether it's racial reconciliation, whether it's short-term missions or the rest. So that is one. Of course, you also, go to the belly of the beast, right? Liberty University, and you had had some connection with Luis Palau's son, I think Kevin Palau. So give us some perspective there because, again, the Republican Party in large part is made up of evangelicals. I've been to some Republican Party events where it looks almost like a church meeting, which is, I think, probably shocking to some people if they've never been to one of those before. But what did you find even in some of the other contacts that you made?
So, I did get to know Kevin Palau a little bit, and I got attracted to him by the story he told of his relationship with Sam Adams, the mayor of Portland, Oregon, the first openly gay mayor of a major U.S. city. And I got a chance to talk to Kevin and meet Sam as well. And it was interesting to me how they managed to forge an important collaboration, probably the most important for each of them during the time that Sam was mayor. And they're sort of the odd couple, right? A gay mayor, an evangelical leader. But Kevin wanted to, evangelicals to be known what they were for, not what they're against. And Sam needed help running the city, and they forged an incredible relationship. And as Sam said to me, look, every 10 issues, we're going to agree on 8 out of 10. We have a lot more in common than we have that keeps us apart. Why are we always talking about the 2 when we should be talking about the 8? And that was an important lesson for me. And, I carried that with me as I met people in different parts of the country, whether it was in church or in Pikeville, Kentucky. There was always common ground I was able to find. And we lose that in sort of this really angry political atmosphere we have right now.
Yeah, again, and some of that polarization has happened because you sort of had some party leaders kind of set out some areas there. I mean, there was a time, I don't know, maybe I'm older than you are. I can remember a time when you had some fairly liberal Republicans and Nelson Rockefeller, whatever. You had some pretty conservative Democrats, a Sam Nunn or a Scoop Jackson, whatever. Those middle parts of both the Republican Democratic Party seem to have vanished entirely. And, of course, as we talked about in the first hour, some of it is actually driven by hysterics and hyperbole and the rest. But, again, this is one of the reasons why, if nothing else, your book might help both sides to know and learn a little bit more. And that's a natural lead into the chapter on the basket of deplorables, because I would think that people that are progressives would have a more difficult time even understanding those who voted for Trump who maybe were white, working class, blue collar. What did you find there in terms of some of your investigation?
Yeah, so much to sort out there. I mean, what you described there, Kerby, is exactly right. There was a time not so long ago. I'm as old as the hill, so but you don't have to go back very far to remember the blue dog Democrats, right?
Right.
And the Rockefeller Republicans. They don't exist anymore, and because of that, there's no overlap between the parties, and it becomes very easy when you don't have that overlap, when you're divided, to demonize the other. And what's happened is, as the white working class in America has become more and more conservative and Republican and gone for Donald Trump by huge numbers, Democrats have begun to demonize a demagogue against them. A group of people actually used to be one of the pillars of the Democratic Party. So I spent a lot of time in coal country and in Youngstown, Ohio, meeting folks who went for Donald Trump often because they felt betrayed by both parties. 30-year losing streak for the white working class, loss of jobs, loss of life expectancy, hope for the future down, a sense that their kids won't have a future in America. These are the types of people, this is the communities we should be helping. Instead, they, I think, rightly feel abandoned by both parties. And I think that's one of the big stories of today, which we all miss because we're too busy saying, we're right, they're wrong. Sort of that's the end of the story.
Well, and since you mentioned coal, let's get to the chapter there. I love the turn of phrase, instead of the grand old party, the grand coal party. That gets us into climate change, gets us into coal, it gets us into West Virginia. By the way, the closest I can come up with a conservative Democrat right now would be Senator Manchin, which is West Virginia, or something like that. And I don't even think he's going to vote for the tax reform bill, although it sounded like he might have if some concessions came his direction. But that's a whole other issue as well, the question of climate change, the EPA, Appalachia. Again, you had a chance to kind of study some of that as well, didn't you?
Yeah, it's where, I came away from this trip actually thinking, to a certain extent, Kerby, I'll tell you, pox on both parties, because I think people have forgotten how to think about the other side. So, I mean, I didn't, as I studied climate change, I didn't think very highly of the Republicans who denied science on the issue for a long time. But I also, when you sit in Pikeville, Kentucky, a place that's seen its economy completely gutted over the last 15 years by the demise of coal, you wonder why the government in Washington and other places have forgotten these folks. The climate policy, the war on coal has done no favors to big parts of this country, and it hasn't really done much for solving the problem of climate change, but it has done a lot to really make a lot of people feel abandoned.
Yeah, and when we talk about that, even if we say, okay, we've got changes in the climate right now, what can we do? Those are some other questions that we won't get into today, but we certainly have had around the table discussions about what could be actually done in terms of meeting some of those IPCC guidelines and what would work. And it seems to me that even when we acknowledge the problem of a changing climate, we still recognize there's only a little bit we can do in terms of policy changes, and there's some devastation that will come to, as you said, the economies of some of these places. So we need to take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into a little bit more, try to do as best I can to cover about half of it in the first half hour. We'll cover the rest of it in the second half hour, and if you'd like to join us, love to get your comments. Ken Stern with us today, and again, as we mentioned before, president of Palisades Media Ventures, and a former CEO of the National Public Radio, and the author of this book, Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And as we go to a break, let me just mention that the other day when we were doing an interview with Foster Freeze, he said, well, you've been broadcasting on Point of View since 1972, 45 years. So I'll tell you what, I will provide a $45,000 match, and that is good until the end of this year. But that's 2 weeks from today. So if you are thinking about supporting this ministry, we would greatly appreciate that. Just take the time to go to the website, pointofview.net. There's a banner there, and that means your gift of $100 becomes $200. A gift of $200 becomes $400. Or if you'd like to talk to someone, let me give you a different number than the on-air number I just gave you, and that is where you can talk to someone off-air if you'd like to make a pledge or give a gift. 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Somebody will be glad to talk to you off air as well. And so we have some information today about these books that we've talked about, these interviews. So visit the website, pointofview.net. And when we come back, we will look a little bit more at a couple of other important issues that come from the book, Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. That's the on-air line, and we will take those calls as well right after this.
Taylor has been listening to Point of View Radio for about 12 years, which is pretty remarkable considering today he's only 25.
In high school, when I first became aware of the political spectrum and all that, I was in conservative ideologues, basically, going with whatever conservatives said. But after listening to the show over the years, I've realized that I'm supposed to be for truth. I'm supposed to be a Christian and then a conservative. And I'm supposed to look at all this that's going on around us in today's culture through a biblical lens. And I can't thank y'all enough for that.
The you Taylor is thanking is you. People like you are the heroes who have patiently invested in Point of View Radio and made it possible to shape hearts and minds across the nation, which in the long run helps to shape our future. And you can be twice the hero today because we have a matching challenge which doubles your investment dollar for dollar up to at least $45,000. But you have to act. Please give at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Your $50 gift means $100 to us. Any amount doubles. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Friend Half Hour, you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. This may be just one of those programs you want to just sit back and listen, and feel free to do so, as that we're getting close to the Christmas week here. So, again, we are talking with Ken Stern. The book is entitled Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it on our website in case you'd like to order it as well. your chapter on the Party of Science. I love this because George Will, I think you probably saw this in October, talked about, well, if the Democrats are supposed to be the Party of Science, then some of it seems pretty anti-scientific. Of course, there's been a counterpoint back and forth between him and the Washington Post. And, of course, the Republican Party's always been identified, especially if you see some of the books that you will find in a Barnes & Noble or other places, as a party of anti-science. But given the fact that I've got a few degrees in science, sometimes as you talk about everything from creation to GMOs to energy policy, there's some times where I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat, you just got to kind of roll your eyes or shake your head. I'm sure you found the same thing.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time, thinking about this issue, and the conclusion I came to, Kerby, was people are for science when it agrees with them, when it's convenient to them. And both parties,
said.
They operate in the flag of science, sort of a flag of convenience. And I think, as I looked at GMOs, and many liberals are anti-GMOs, where the science is quite clear that it's genetically modified foods are perfectly safe. And then look at climate science as well. So the fact of the matter is, we all use science for our own ends, and that's a little bit of a point of sadness for me, and probably for you as a scientist.
Well, and one of the concerns I have, since you did talk a little bit about energy policy and whether you're going to use coal and whether we're going to all drive Tesla cars and on and on and on and on, is, I'm always up for if you've got a good argument, but if right now you say we can solve our problem with wind and solar and you can wave your hands, I'm going, I wish we could, but I'm not seeing that at all. And if you are convinced that we're all supposed to drive electric cars, you've done enough of the math as well as I have to recognize that, well, most of that is going to be then burning coal at a power plant to drive electricity to drive your car. So some of the rhetoric on the other side by environmentalists, and believe me, I was involved in Earth Day. I am older than you. On 1970, when Earth Day, we brought Sierra Club people into my high school. Okay, yeah. So I've looked at this with a desire to try to come up with clean energy, but I've also recognized there's some hard thermodynamic facts that mitigate against that. And that's where sometimes the so-called Party of Science, the Democratic Party, or especially the environmentalists, just aren't being real with some of the facts and figures that we seem to have been able to develop up until this point.
I think you're exactly right, Kerby. It's look, I think the science is fairly cooked at this point. The Earth is getting warmer. It's driven by man-made. It's driven by man. But that doesn't answer what you do about it. It's an incredibly complex ecosystem. Public policy is a pretty blunt instrument to solve these types of problems. And the things that liberals have gravitated towards aren't easy solutions, and they may not be solutions at all. And there is, I think, sort of the sense from the left that we're right on the science, therefore we must be right on the public policy too. And those two things one thing doesn't really follow from the other. And I think that's where I began to run into problems with my colleagues on the left in terms of climate science.
Well, we'll go from one controversial one to another, and that is you also talk about, dealing with the issue of poverty. And again, this is one of those frustrations from a policy point of view. We had a Great Society program, a war on poverty. We spent trillions of dollars. It seems to me, again, this is one of the places where I think the church does have some answers, because lots of times these faith-based organizations are more helpful than just money, because by definition, government can only send money and only can create policies. But again, you've seen some real divide here, but when any time somebody tries to come up with possible solutions, usually they get shouted down as being insensitive to the poor or pushing mama off the cliff, or, you've seen all of those. And how do we think through that?
Yeah, it's a hard one. They're all hard. And that's part of the thing that gets lost in the rhetoric, which is these are complex issues that don't have easy solutions, and many of these solutions don't work. But on the poverty programs, we've spent $22 trillion over time trying to reduce poverty in this country, and we really haven't been successful. We've made poverty better, and that's actually an important achievement.
That is true.
Let's recognize that. It's much better to be poor in the United States now than it was 50 years ago. there's still the same percentage of poor people as there was when Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty. So I think that, from my perspective, means we really should spend some time rethinking it, not just are you for poverty programs or do you hate poor people, but how do you actually solve this problem? And, the time in the United States history when poverty went down the most was not in a period of increased spending on poverty programs. It was a period of economic growth. And that's probably what getting more people jobs, getting people trained for jobs, getting people opportunities to get to the jobs, that's probably the thing that works best. I
would think so. As I've said before, probably the best anti-poverty program is job creation. And in that chapter, I thought, I've got a friendship with Sam Brownback, but, we'll be hard on him for a minute, because I think you also illustrated something that Republicans need to listen to, and that is that oftentimes we are told that local governments, state governments are laboratories of experiment. And as you point out, we have listeners in Kansas, so they probably know the story only so well, but listeners in the other states probably don't. Some of these laboratories experiments fail, don't they? And they aren't as successful as you might hope. That's why I'd like to have those experiments taking place at the lowest level rather than implement a really bad policy nationwide out of Washington, D.C.
I think that's a fair point. But the whole idea of the laboratory invention in the state, reflects the fact that sometimes lab experiments blow up, as I wrote in the book. And the question is, do we actually learn? Are we smart enough to learn when they do blow up? And we talked about the revolution in the cornfield, as it was called, of reducing taxes, cutting government, trying to create more jobs that way, which failed miserably in Kansas under Governor Brownback's leadership. And we've seen, it was, I think, appropriate from one perspective to try that, but it's not appropriate not to learn that lesson. And the Kansas legislature, which is as conservative as can be, have now basically refuted that experiment. I wish the rest of the country would learn from that, the hard costs that Kansas incurred.
Well, again, you've got some of that in the book, and again, we can encourage people to read that. One more chapter I thought I'd just get to before we take our next break, The Party of the Press. And again, that is just you were talking about everything from the internet to the whole issue of back and forth. That's, I think, one of the topics we tend to fall back on, Ken, every Wednesday when we have our millennial roundtable, because I think our millennials here oftentimes say, I'm just appalled at the vilification, the name-calling, the polarization that has happened, because now everybody gets a place to express their opinions, and oftentimes the people with the most radical, most vitriolic opinions are the ones that get the most amount of attention and press. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'm with your millennials. I'm too old to be invited to the roundtable, like you, but I think they're onto something. I think one of the challenges is everyone's got their own press, so we can just listen to people who agree with us. It's the confirmation bias that drives American politics right now. And it's turned out, everyone's learned the lesson. Being angry, being loud, drives the audience. And everyone has learned that. Everyone follows. And that's not just, the conservative talkers or the MSNBC. It's, the people that are supposed to be in the middle. And, I come from mainstream media, spent a decade at NPR, but people wanted to talk to me about, my book's not about the press, but people wanted to talk to me about the fact that they feel left out of the conversation in mainstream media. They felt that it doesn't reflect them. And I think that was an important learning that I had along the way, which is, mainstream media, I had my bubble, and they're part of that bubble as well. And if they're going to represent the whole country, and they need to get out in ways that they haven't done recently.
Yeah, if I've heard it once, I've heard it a number of times. They may have a program called All Things Considered, but sometimes it feels to me like it's Some Things Considered. Some of the things that are important to me never get considered and never get part of the roundtable. Well, now with social media, some of those get considered, but people that maybe haven't earned the right to express an informed position get as much, sometimes more attention than some of the others. So it's a fascinating set of circumstances. But let's take a break. We come back. We have a couple of other things to cover, the end and the beginning, and most importantly, is it possible to bridge the polar divide that we see? Is politicization just something that is going to be a reality, especially as we get into the 2018 election season? Love to get your thoughts, and we'll get some from Ken Stern right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. As the school semester winds down to Christmas break, it's important to take a look at all the ways students might exercise their religious freedom in celebration of the holidays. First, schools can celebrate Christmas just as easily as they can celebrate winter. Doing so provides an educational perspective of world history and the effect of religion upon culture. Schools can also deck the halls in Christmas decorations. Decorations can further the cultural and religious heritage educationally important to the holiday. Third, schools can include Christmas-themed artistic expressions in school plays. As long as it's presented in an objective manner reflecting the traditions of Christmas, it's just fine. It is fine for students to wish one another Merry Christmas or Happy Hanukkah, and even hand out gifts significant to their religious tradition. As they can throughout the year, students can also reference their faith in school assignments, class discussions, and private speeches during the holidays. The First Amendment is not suspended during the Christmas season. And finally, school employees can discuss their religious holiday traditions outside of their official roles as educators. This means teachers can attend Christmas parties and religious gatherings outside of work without fearing the loss of their job. With that, perhaps the best way to conclude is merely to say Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and best wishes for a Happy New Year to all our students. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Ken Stern. His book is entitled Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. You know, in your last chapter, you talk about the fact that the year has changed you. I'd love to have you maybe reflect on that for just a minute and then talk about where do we go from here? How can we bridge the gap that is seemingly growing wider, this maw that separates us left and right, Republican, Democrat? Can you, first of all, maybe share how this last year has really changed you?
Yeah, so it's changed me a lot of ways. It changed my view on a number of issues, but I don't think that's really the important takeaway for me. It was my view of the other side, the people on the other side. You know, we live in a world in which one side calls, you know, the folks on the right deplorables, and the other side call, you know, those people on the left snowflakes or other names. And you know, I think they're all wrong. I think, you know, we're one country with people trying to do the right things for their family and their communities and trying to make the best choices. And we're all hampered by the fact we're only seeing one side of the story. And the thing that makes me most angry now is how we demagogue the other side and not look for the common ground like in ways that I think we used to. And that's really sort of the major takeaway for me.
Let's talk about common ground for just a minute, because, one of my friends, Cal Thomas and Bob Beckel, used to do a column called Common Ground. I'm sure you saw it in USA Today. I read it all the time. They had a book that came out. They ended that years ago. There's I thought that was a testimony right there that it ran its course. I understand that. But some of those opportunities to get two different sides having cordial conversation, not like Crossfire, not like some of the cable TV, but where there's a honest, okay, I understand what you're saying, but here, what about this? Versus everybody's just got their talking points and they're not really trying to listen to one another. That was one model that I've seen, the common ground model. Another I mentioned earlier, Foster Free's been on the program. He did what was called the civility challenge that we promoted, where he says, go and meet with somebody that you may not agree with. That could be for a person that believes in religious liberty, somebody with the ACLU, somebody that believes in traditional values, somebody that's with LGBT, whatever it might be, and have a cup of coffee, and I'll even pay for it. It just seems to me that we've got to come up with something that bridges the gap, because in your book and in my previous commentaries from the book The Big Sort, there are a lot of individuals in your world and in my world that will never even meet each other, talk to each other, and at best they'll only talk at each other, and that's not going to heal the divide, is it?
No, I think it doesn't. I mean, one of the things that drove me to do this is actually the social science research that shows, in one way, polarization hasn't gotten worse. We don't actually disagree with each other any more on the issues than we did, 20 years ago. We have differences. Of course we do. We should have those differences in democracy. But they're not any worse than before. What we are is much more angry about it and much more open to demagoguing the other side. Right. And that's the thing that worries me. There is a reaction going on, though, I think. The one trend that I think people don't pay much attention to is people actually leaving the Democratic Party. They're leaving the Republican Party. They're more independents. They're now 42% in the country describe themselves as independents. And less are in the individual parties. And that's not because the people have changed their views. They're just kind of sick and tired of this discord. And I think there is going to be a tipping point in the future when more and more people stand up and say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, and are willing to say, our political system is broken. We need to have a different way.
Well, and again, one of the articles we posted by David French, who was in studio with us just about a week and a half ago, is he said, for the average American who pays less attention to politics than to his professional and personal life, all of this is exhausting. It's numbing to the point that he can't possibly determine what's important, what's not, so he checks out. He throws his hands in the air, gives up. And for the Americans who care the most about politics and drive our public debate, perpetual crisis is invigorating. It provides meaning and purpose. So there's the divide. But again, if I can use my Millennial Roundtable as an example, there are more millennials that have a Facebook account than are even registered to vote. Now, Ken, you and I both know that the younger you are, the less likely you are to be registered to vote, the less likely you are to vote. So that's not atypical. But these percentages are much lower. And if this hue and cry and hyperbole and hysterics continue and the demagoguery continues, we're going to have very few people going to the polls in this next primary and the next general election because they're just going to be tired. They're just going to throw up their hands and give up. And so I hope we can bridge the divide, and I hope this book is at least one small step in that direction. So thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me on the show. I enjoyed it.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we're going to get into some other issues that are certainly relevant to this conversation. And let me just mention that first article we've posted there today by David French goes into this in a lot more detail. This is a concern that I have, is that we are finding a situation where some of these ideas and some of these individuals just get vilified. And so I thought this book might be an interesting conversation starter for you. Tomorrow, we're going to get into some other very important topics. As we did today, I always like, as we get closer to Christmas, do some things that really will help you with your Christian life. So we're going to be talking with Mark Woods in the first hour. His book is entitled, Does the Bible Really Say That? He's a Baptist minister, and will give us some perspective on some ways to really think biblically about some of these big, important issues. And then Andrew Walker will be with us in the second hour. We're going to talk about God and the transgender debate. He serves as the Director of Policy Studies at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is part of the Southern Baptist Convention. So those are going to be some conversations we will have tomorrow. Of course, Wednesday, Millennial Roundtable, our Friday weekend edition, all sorts of covering issues that we will talk about. And if you just happened to join us in the second hour, didn't hear the first hour interview, let me just mention real quickly that we did have Sean McDowell with us as we talked about his book, The Fate of the Apostles. Now, as he points out, is an academic book. So actually, when you go to that information, you will notice that it's a little more expensive than the typical book, but as you get over sticker shock, I think it still would be a book that you'd want to have on your shelf if you really want to be effective in terms of doing apologetics. But he also offered the fact that he took a summary of that material and put it in the latest edition of Evidence That Demands a Verdict. That was a book written 40 years ago by Josh McDowell. It's been updated dramatically. There's whole new chapters in that, and so even if you have the old Evidence That Demands a Verdict, you'll want to get the new one, and it includes some great material that will help you be more effective. And as you well know, one of the things we like to do here on Point of View is help you know how to articulate a biblical worldview and also how to know how to defend a biblical worldview, and we'll certainly be spending a fair amount of time in the first hour tomorrow talking about that. Just before we go, let me mention that we do have this matching challenge. I mentioned Foster Freeze just a minute ago, a very gracious philanthropist who, after hearing us talk about the fact that this broadcast has been on for 45 years, Marlon Maddox started back in 1972, hard to believe. 45 years of broadcasting, he wanted to put together a $45,000 matching pledge. In the first hour, I mentioned that we're about halfway through this because, let's recognize, 2 weeks from today, it's 2018. So we only have a very short amount of time for you to help us with this pledge. So please, if you can, I would encourage you, even as we get off the program today, off the air, take the time to either go to the website, pointofview.net, or give us a call on our order line, 800-347-5151, and your gift of any size will be doubled. So again, we've given you some suggested amounts, $100, $150, $250, whatever you might want to do. And that means $100 becomes $200, $250 becomes $500. So consider what you might do to help us out. And as we've said before, appreciated stock would be another way that you can give and help us meet that match as well. So take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you'll also see some of the other things I've posted. I've been doing for the last couple of days, kind of an analysis of these Christmas carols we sing so often. What's the history behind them? What's the theology behind them today? O Little Town of Bethlehem. Each day we cover a different choir message and carol and hymn, so take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Today, you can make a difference, but you have to act. Recently, Kerby sat down with a couple in California, Stan and Jennifer. Jennifer said, like many Christians, they were concerned about the direction of the culture, but simply hoped something would change. On one of her regular walks through the neighborhood, listening to the radio, she happened to cross Point of View, and before long, she was convinced wishing things would change was not enough. She began taking what she was learning and applying it and sharing it. She even went to the state capitol in Sacramento to stand up for what she believes. You would be surprised how much difference one Jennifer can make, and how many Jennifers you can inspire by giving to Point of View. Your gift today will shape hearts and minds across the nation, helping to shape our future. And thanks to a surprise donor challenge, your gift will be doubled up to at least $45,000. Give today at pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Answer the challenge. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the